So I'm going to talk about two papers because I was invited to talk about this. And first, I would like to introduce what I mean by indigenous environmental ethic and environmental ethics. Now, I use the term an indigenous environmental ethic to mean the set of values and beliefs of an individual or group of people in relation to the natural environment. And the concept environmentalism also refers to the action aimed at protecting the environment. Environmental ethics is a new subject, as earlier indicated by the chairperson of the first panel. It is the study of the ethical relationship between human beings and the natural environment. And it is also a branch of applied ethics, which is related to practical issues and matters arising from such transactions. And environmental philosophy is a big subject. It covers different areas. Among others, it includes environmental ethics, environmental metaphysics, environmental epistemology, theology, the philosophy of science, and so on and so forth. When we talk about indigenous environmental philosophy in Africa or African environmental ethics, there is no one single universal African environmental ethics. Because as you know, there are about 54 countries and different ethnic groups in the continent. Therefore, when we talk about African environmental ethics, we are referring to the common or shared environmental world views of different ethnic groups. Having said that, let me try to reflect on the views of my colleague and friend, Dr. Terry Ngoso. First, general comments. I enjoyed reading your outline, a particular presentation. You rightly pointed out that African ethics is based on African traditions and values. I completely agree with you. You also stressed the importance of a pluriversal environmental ethics rather than one single universal environmental ethics. You also correctly stated that climate change is an environmental ethics issue or justice issue. I also believe that climate change is fundamentally an ethical and environmental justice issue, precisely because the major contributors of climate change are not suffering from this, but those who contributed less are paying a lot of price. Because of this, therefore, climate change is fundamentally an ethical and environmental justice issue. It is also an economic issue, you also said that. It is also a political, social, and human rights issue. Regarding your presentation, one can also appreciate the DDR model, what you call deconstruction, disconnection, and reconstruction, as applied to ethics in Africa. You also correctly emphasized, and other colleagues also indicated this, the interconnectedness of human beings, non-human beings, and the natural environment. But I have some disagreements with you, my colleague. First, the title of the paper is misleading and rehashing issues some scholars have been working on for years in African philosophy. There is no doubt that African environmental ethics is alive and well. So I don't really think that this question is relevant in the 21st century. Second, you didn't clearly define the concepts you used in your paper. You didn't tell us what you meant by environmental ethics. And what do you mean by universal environmental ethics? You were emphasizing that what particular Western philosophers said is a kind of universal environmental ethics. That is not clear to me. And as you know, there is no one single environmental ethics, even in Western environmental ethics. There are different methods, different approach in Western environmental ethics. Among others, where, for example, anthropocentric environmental ethics or human-centered environmental ethics. We have also individualistic, non-anthropocentric environmental ethics. We have biocentric environmental ethics, what we call life-centered approach, and ecocentric environmental ethics. There are also some alternative approaches, including deep ecology, social ecology, ecofeminism, and so on and so forth. So there is no doubt that Western environmental philosophers have challenged the mainstream Western worldview. But you seem to question this. You seem to think that only decolonization can challenge Eurocentrism. Just to give you one example, one of the first European environmental philosophers who talked about the need for a new environmental ethic was an Australian philosopher, Richard Rutledge. He presented his paper during the 12th World Congress of Philosophy in 1973. What are the basic ideas of Rutledge? First, he said his premise is ethics is fundamentally about what ethical principles we believe in. And second, ethical principles apply even in remote possible worlds. Third, Western ethical principle, that is, chauvinism is inconsistent with an environmental ethics. That is the conclusion drawn from his thought experiment, particularly the last man's argument. Because of time constraint, I am not going to explain about the last man's argument. You also talked about decolonizing ethics and environmental ethics in Africa. What do you mean by decolonization? What does it really mean? Do you think that environmental ethics was colonized in Africa? If so, when? Was it in the 20th century or in the 21st century? Or, as we all know, the discipline of environmental ethics did not exist in Africa during the colonial era. Even in the West, the subject environmental ethics began in the 1970s when some Western philosophers questioned Western tradition, the mainstream Western worldview. Again, given the absence of actual colonization, does it make sense to talk about decolonizing environmental philosophy in Ethiopia? Do you suggest that African environmental ethics should be decoupled from Western environmental ethics? Do you think that Western environmental ethics and African environmental ethics have something in common? For me, yes, there are a lot of common elements that are shared by Western environmental ethics and African environmental ethics. A Nigerian philosopher, Olufemi Taimo, said that decolonization should not be our focus in the 21st century. So we talked about decolonization. For example, the decolonization of flag and so on and so forth. So my question is, do you agree with this statement? Olufemi Taiwo published a book entitled Against Decolonization, taking African agency seriously. So I would like to invite all of you to read this book and try to reflect on the concept decolonization in the 21st century. And again, regarding Western environmental ethics, you appear to have contradictory positions. On the one hand, you said that Western-centric environmental ethics does not need to be adopted. On the other hand, you said Western-centric environmental ethics should be integrated with African environmental ethics. For example, you said Ubuntu philosophy. Are you saying that no one has ever tried to do this in the past? And my question is again, are you familiar with Native American, Asian, Latin American environmental ethics and philosophy? Among others, for example, a Western environmental philosopher, Callicott, published a book entitled in 1994, where he discussed different traditions, different indigenous environmental traditions in different parts of the world, including in America, Native American environmental ethics and Asian environmental ethics. He called it African biocommunitarianism, and again, indigenous environmental ethics in Australia and so forth. The title of his book is Earth's Insights. So would you consider Callicott, for example, as a colonial environmental philosopher? That is another important question I would like to ask you. And again, you haven't consulted the relevant literature on Western and African environmental ethics. Instead, you relied on Marley White's MA thesis. I think he is based in Canada. He talked about decolonizing environmental philosophy in the Anthropocene toward a philosophy for planetary healing. So you didn't refer to any work, or probably very few works in Africa, but you didn't refer to any work in the Western tradition because you simply said that they talked about universal environmental ethics. There is no one universal Western environmental ethics, as I said earlier. And again, you didn't finally tell us whether there is an African environmental ethics, in spite of the fact that the title of your presentation is there any environmental ethics in Africa? And again, you didn't tell us the weaknesses of African environmental ethics. And what you discussed under the global ethics of sustainability is very good, but you didn't discuss the contributions of African environmental ethics to sustainable development by referring to the work of, for example, African and non-African philosophers. I myself discussed this issue in 2011 and particularly in 2024. And Tosam, your colleague, a Cameroonian philosopher, also published an article on this and so forth. So I mentioned some articles written by various philosophers, particularly in Asia, in America, Northern America, and in Africa, and so forth. So, among others, the person I mentioned, Calicote, he published an article called Earth's Insights, a survey of ecological ethics from the Mediterranean basin to the Australian outback. And others also talked about this. I also talked about the rehabilitation of indigenous environmental ethics in Africa in 2005. And I also discussed these issues, particularly in my article, which can be considered as the history of environmental ethics in Africa, environmental philosophy in Africa. The title of my paper was Environmental Philosophy in African Traditions of Thought. So others also talked about this. As I said earlier, a Cameroonian philosopher, Tosam, published an article called African Environmental Ethics and Sustainable Development. An American philosopher and other colleagues, Verhaeren, also published an article called African Environmental Ethics, Keys to Sustainable Development Through Ecological Village. So let me proceed to the second paper, Corrective or Distributive Climate Justice. Which one should African negotiators emphasize? It was by Dr. Axel Gosseres. Gosseres promised to send me his outline on December 6th, but he didn't send me. So my comment is simply based on the abstract he sent me. So the abstract was very, very condensed. So I didn't have much from that. So he claimed that African negotiators should place greater emphasis on global distributive obligations rather than collective justice. But my argument is developed nations during climate negotiations, international negotiations, are reluctant to confront climate injustice, regardless of the type of climate justice that African negotiators choose. Dr. Gosseres didn't tell us how African negotiators can influence particularly Western and other powerful negotiators during climate negotiations, influence them and try to change their positions. But because of the concept, the role of power dynamics, and at the same time, international system which is unjust, African countries, particularly African negotiators were not able to influence these Western negotiators. So what is climate justice? You try to tell us about the difference between two forms of climate justice, what you call corrective climate justice and distributive climate justice. As you said, climate justice can be defined in various ways. So I simply try to indicate key aspects of climate justice. Procedural justice, focusing on fair, transparent, inclusive, and participatory decision-making. Distributive justice, you emphasize the role of this. It refers to who bears the burdens of responding to climate change. It also includes interconnectedness, the interconnected nature of the global climate system. It also includes various other elements. Because of time constraint, I cannot go into details. It includes, among others, intergenerational justice, environmental justice. It also includes indigenous knowledge and so on and so forth. So when you look at the current situation, particularly the impact of climate change on the whole world, we find disproportionate impacts. Particularly developing countries face disproportionate climate change impacts. One example is African countries. As you know, the contribution of African countries to climate change, to global warming is insignificant. Their contribution is less than 4%. Africa only emits 2 to 3% of the world's energy and industrial carbon dioxide, with 0.8 metric tons of a carbon footprint per person compared to the global average of 3.9 tons. What I would like to emphasize is the fact that in Africa, the major contributors to climate change are agriculture and land use. And very few countries, particularly South Africa, Nigeria, and others, are the major contributors to climate change. But other African countries are not really the major contributors to climate change. Climate justice and international climate negotiations. As you know, I just would like to remind you that the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, it is also known as the Earth Summit, established the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992 during the Rio Conference. So this convention entered into force in 1994. And again, parties to the convention started to gather once a year since 1995. So the first COP took place in Berlin in 1995, and after that, they continued to do so. And we have also the Kyoto Protocol in 1995, and we have the Paris Agreement in 2015, which is one of the most important contributions of the Conference of Parties. So the Paris Agreement was based on voluntary cooperation among countries. So because of this, it has been very difficult to implement some of the important decisions of the Paris Agreement. So again, we can also mention COP27, which took place 2 years ago. 3 years ago, they agreed to address the question of loss and damage. In particular, Western countries were not willing to address this problem, loss and damage. So because if we try to accept this, developing countries will ask us to compensate them. So because of this, for many years, they refused to address this problem. But at the end of the day, they agreed to address this problem. And again, COP 2018 agreed to triple renewable energy, converting all fossil fuels in the energy system to renewable energy, such as wind and solar. So the agreement is that countries have promised to triple global renewable energy capacity by 2030. And again, COP 2019 took place just last month, from November 11 to 2024 in Azerbaijan. So negotiators agreed to triple financing from wealthy countries to developing countries by 2035, from 100 billion per year to 300 billion. So they boosted that. So we increased 3 times. So earlier we agreed to give $100 billion to developing countries so that developing countries will be able to address climate change issues, particularly climate change adaptation, and at the same time mitigation and so on and so forth. But even with that, developing countries were not happy. But now, this year, they said that we promise to give you 300 billion in 2035. So we did well. But many developing countries are not satisfied with this because this is not really sufficient to address climate change adaptation problems and other related issues. And another problem is there is no binding agreement. Very few countries probably will try to fulfill this pledge. And again, COP29 failed to make progress on setting targets and tracking indicators for the transition away from fossil fuels and affront to climate justice. My question is, why is climate justice still unaddressed? I've explained some reasons. I will also reiterate some of these reasons. Despite some positive steps taken at various times, climate justice remains unresolved. The first reason is negotiating countries pay attention to economic interest, economic self-interest, and carbon is the lifeblood of the global economy. Therefore, many countries are reluctant to reduce the use of fossil fuels, and because of this, therefore, it has been very difficult to address the question of justice, the question of power. And developing countries and other groups, environmental groups, cannot force Western capitalist countries, I mean, powerful capitalist countries, to address the problem of climate change and at the same time to translate international laws into practice. So, an instrumental reason does not ask what ethics and justice require. And in 29, wealthy nations pledged to give developing countries $100 billion, but very few wealthy countries fulfilled their promise. And the challenge of building consensus at the UN climate talks. So this method is inadequate because unless otherwise all negotiating parties agree, they cannot make any decisions. But it has been very, very difficult. And as I said, it has also been very difficult to enforce environmental laws and treaties because of this. And again, it has been very difficult to implement, among others, for example, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, REDD Plus finance created in 2007. Many countries have tried to implement this, including my own country. But the approach was a carbon-centric approach, for example, in Ethiopia, and the same thing happened in Tanzania. And finally, this approach evicted peasant farmers from their areas, and corruption was also involved. So what is required is a pro-poor approach should be in place. If you do this, we'll be able to address these problems. So regarding this question, I published some articles, and therefore, if you are interested, you can read this, Climate Change Impacts and Planning in Africa, and particularly Climate Ethics and Policy in Africa. I discussed this, how African ethics can help African countries and even other countries to address this problem. Thank you very much for your attention.